So last week, we began a discussion about Reformation church history, and we discussed some of the background, some of the introductory issues concerning Reformation church history. We spoke about things such as the political setting of the Reformation, and within that topic, that matter, we spoke about the fact that the middle class, as a result, not just as a result of the plague, but the plague was a big factor in bringing about the development of the middle class. Cities and towns became increasingly important. There was a greater centralization of population in cities and towns away from rural areas. Centralism was a new political trend. Spain was the strongest empire in Europe, primarily as a result of the discovery of the Americas and the fact that they had their exploitation of the riches of the Americas created a greater, a stronger nation because of it. We also spoke about the Ottoman Empire, which was Muslim. Islam had retreated from Europe for the most part, but it had conquered Turkey, today's Turkey, and of course, most of the Middle East, North Africa. But in Europe, it had been expelled from Europe finally in 1492 when they were expelled from Spain. And so that serves as the political backdrop to the Reformation. Tonight, we'll talk about some of the religious factors that brought about the Reformation. The first of which was the changing image of the papacy. The papacy, of course, had for centuries been corrupt. But for the most part, the people were pretty much oblivious to the majority of the corruptions of the papacy. In the 15th century and the 14th, really, into the 15th century, and of course, as the 16th century dawned, that corruption, the immorality of the papal office became more and more prevalent, especially as Wycliffe came on the scene, then Huss, and of course Savonarola and the rest of the reformers. They shine a bright light on papal corruption. There was a concentration of power, and you could say that there was a papal monarchy. The Pope was so powerful that he was the one that installed kings and emperors. Diplomacy had become all important to the papacy. And without being able to have the favor of the Pope, any ruler was in danger of losing credibility and losing power. The papal nuncio, which is the ambassador of the Pope, cardinals and other bishops in countries, installed in certain countries, wielded great power. It was really a well-managed administration that the papacy conducted. However, there was one issue that they were having problems with, and that was the raising of money. Obviously, because they were having problems raising money, this was a great temptation to corruption. And indeed, it resulted in great corruption. For example, I mentioned last week the practice of simony, which was the selling of religious offices. And they did that. For example, they would sell a bishopric to a particularly rich individual because this individual wanted to have more influence than he would be able to have if he were not a religious individual. And so you had a lot of clergy that were not appointed by the church because of their merits, but rather they were in office because they had simply bought the office. And so there was a tremendous amount of that practice going on. There was undermining this practice, among others, undermined the respect that the populace had for the papacy. The papacy had become known for its greed and ambition. And in the 14th century, it took place. The Babylonian captivity of the church took place, which was basically the situation where you had, at one point, there were as many as 3 popes. One of them was the Avignon papacy in France. You had a pope in France, you had one in Rome, you had another one installed in other cities within France. And so for almost 70 years, you had popes and counter popes. And obviously, that was a tremendous distraction and problem within the church. And the credibility of the church, which was suffering greatly up to this point, became even more strained. That led to a great schism within the church between 1378 and 1409. And at that point, now there were 2 popes. There were no longer 3, but now there were 2 still in office, calling each other, excommunicating each other, and calling each other illegitimate. The Council of Pisa, a conservative council, was called at the end of, or at the beginning of the 15th century, hoping to have one of the popes resign and to elect another pope. The problem is that in doing so, they elected another pope, but the 2 others refused to resign. And so now you had again 3 popes. Finally, the Council of Constance in 1414 was called to address this problem. And at the council, the cardinals, the prelates that were there, concluded that councils were superior to popes. As such, it deposed the popes and elected Martin V as being the actual ruling and legitimate pope. The other 3, one was condemned, the other 2 resigned and apologized to the council for what they had done. And one was arrested and imprisoned. This council also is notable because it burned Ian Hus at the stake. You remember, I think I mentioned Hus last week. We'll talk about him a little more in detail, but Hus was an early reformer in Bohemia, what is today the Czech Republic. And he believed that the scripture alone was the authority for the church and for the Christian. And for those beliefs, he was burned at the stake. The council also condemned Wycliffe, who had died about 30 years earlier. So obviously they could not reach Wycliffe anymore. He was in heaven already. And you can be sure that he couldn't care less what the council was doing. But nevertheless, it condemned Wycliffe and exhumed his bones and burned them as well, and threw the ashes on the river Swift. After this episode, a clever poet wrote a little ditty about the fact that the ashes of Wycliffe were thrown on the river Swift, and thus they reach every corner of Europe with the truth of Scripture. The Council of Basel took place between 1431 and 1449. This council completed the work of Constance. Constance left a few things to be resolved, and it worked as a sort of legislature. The council itself, however, was divided into 2, Ferrara and Basel. And so this decreed papal absolutism, hard word to get out, and conciliar supremacy. In other words, the Pope was the supreme and only head of the church, but again, it reiterated what Constance had ruled, which is that the councils are superior to the Pope. In 1054, the Eastern Church and the Western Church had separated. He suffered a schism. Keep saying schism, a schism. But at the Council of Basel, the Greek representatives yielded to Roman supremacy, trying to bring together again the parties. However, Constantinople, the main see of the eastern side of the church, rejected that agreement. And to this day, as you know, the western and eastern sides of the church remain separate. Of course, there's been many ecumenical councils and movements attempting to bring the two parties together. But I think that the main issue is the fact that the eastern side does not recognize papal supremacy. In the East, there's a collegiality that reigns supreme. In other words, the Patriarch of Constantinople, of Antioch, of Jerusalem, etc., they are all on equal footing. Whereas on the Western side, the Pope of Rome exercises authority over the whole of the church. And so that, I think, is the biggest problem. Just to show some of the examples of the corruption of the popes up to this point, Innocent VIII had 8 illegitimate children. Alexander VI was probably the most corrupt of popes. His real name was Rodrigo Borgia, and I don't know if you remember the Borgias. I think there was a TV show some time back that spoke about the Borgias, who were notorious for their corruptions. Cesare Borgia was a nephew of Rodrigo, and he himself was appointed a bishop in the church. Lucretia Borgia was his daughter, and she also resided at the papal residency, conducting all manner of immoral activities. And so that's just a couple of the examples of the corruptions, the immorality of the popes, which really are legend. At the beginning of the 16th century, Julian II came to the papal throne. He is the one that began the construction of the Sistine Chapel at St. Peter's. And he also took to the sword to expand the territory of the papacy. For this, he was called the Fighting Pope. Erasmus, who was Erasmus of Rotterdam, who was one of the reformers that did not break with the church. And you may remember him as being the one who was the first to publish a Greek New Testament, but nevertheless, he called Julius Exclusus, or Julius the Exclusive, because of his tendency to do what he did. He also began some of the artistic renaissance. If you have seen the movie about Michelangelo, where Charlton Heston plays Michelangelo, Julian was the Pope. He was played by Rex Harrison. And so during that time when Michelangelo was painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, Julian was the Pope. And by the way, we have been to the Sistine Chapel. At the time that we went, they were renovating it. So they had these scaffoldings all over the chapel. But nevertheless, you see that a tremendously impressive work. And you think about how one man was able to do all that, and obviously the talent that God has given man, because it truly is a tremendously impressive sight. I have some pictures in my album about them. Of course, talking about the 1980s, the pictures are kind of blurry. They're not the greatest quality, but even so, you can appreciate the impressiveness of the work. After Julian comes Leo X, who is from the Medici line. You also may have heard about the Medicis. And I think they too had a TV show about the Medici family, a very influential family in Europe at this time. Again, bought and sold a lot of the offices, and it was he who was the Pope when Luther comes on the scene of history. Of course, Luther had already been a monk for a number of years before Leo X assumed the papal throne, but when Luther nails his thesis and launches what eventually became the Reformation, Leo X was the Pope. And this Pope, a little bit like his predecessor, was more interested in art than in theology. He it is who will institute the sale of indulgences in order to be able to pay for St. Peter's. And that is the major catalyst that brings about Luther's uh, rebellion, as it were. He excommunicated Luther. He is the Pope that excommunicated Luther, and he is the one that published the bull Et Serge Domini, or Arise, O Lord. And we will talk more about that once we get to the Reformation in earnest. But that, in essence, in a nutshell, is the religious background immediately preceding the Reformation. So hopefully that has been beneficial to you. Next week, we'll talk some more. We'll be getting into the Reformation itself. Of course, begins with Luther. We'll tell a little bit about his history, about his biography, and what led him to do what he did on October 31st, 1517. The rest, as they say, is history. And so hopefully that has been beneficial for you, and we'll continue next week.